Hello everyone, greetings from the Servant of Nero, AJ here, and if there's one thing that intrigues the player base, however faintly, about the history of this game's setting, it's the involvement of the Orgoth. Okay, that was a rather broad and sweeping statement, but you know what I'm getting at. The Orgoth have a strange role in the game, though they are not playable, and their direct presence isn't overt at all except in a couple of IKRPG scenarios. They're virtually non-existent in the game itself, in a material sense, and mostly residual in the setting. However, it's actually been less time between the current in-game time and the Orgoth expulsion than between said expulsion and their arrival in Western Immoren, a consideration worth pondering for a long moment. And what the Orgoth left behind has a not insignificant effect on the world and is a massive driving force for a few playable sub-factions, the most obvious being the Grey Lord's Covenant. Not only that, but the technological and arcane innovations that the rebellion against the Orgoth as much as compelled in the people of Western Immoren are testament to the great change that the invaders instigated. To be clear, this isn't about the Orgoth invasion, occupation, and rebellion years, since a video by House of Dice already covers all of that, link in the description for those who haven't seen it yet. Instead, this is going to be about some of the most important lasting effects and influences of Orgoth presence in Immoren, largely excepting magic, which deserves its own treatment. What follows is by no means exhaustive, however. Even so, magic, as a part of humanity's resources, military or otherwise, finds its origins in the latter years of the occupation era, while measures eventually developed to overthrow the Orgoth overlords included blasting powder and firearms, as well as the early versions of the cortex and their accompanying warjack, or rather, colossal technology. These are taken for granted now, and were it not for the great threat posed by the Orgoth invaders to the very existence of the people of Western Immoren, they may not have come into being, or they would have come into being a great deal more slowly. Further, many descendant incarnations of influential and powerful organizations find their origins in the Great Rebellion against the Orgoth, including the Order of the Golden Crucible and the Fraternal Order of Wizardry, and by association, their splinter groups the Grey Lord Covenant and the Order of Illumination. Indeed, the name Iron Kingdoms itself is derived from the coalition that agreed upon the constituent nations' borders after the final defeat of the Orgoth. In turn, this forerunner to the Iron Kingdoms, called the Iron Alliance, took inspiration from the Iron Fellowship, the short-lived, but far from merely symbolic, rebel organization whose actions are so important to Western Immoren's history that it is their founding and formation that marks a transition from BR to AR of modern human reckoning, while some other races have adopted this for the sake of expedience. Necessity is the mother of all invention, and as the occupation era wore on, said necessity only grew. With it grew hope as the Orgoth stranglehold on the Western Immoren lands gradually loosened, and the people were emboldened with an opportunity to strike back that had a remote chance of victory. This chance needed all the help it could get, and from the talented minds of some of humanity's best arcanists of those early days of magical study came innovations that would make that chance not only a possibility, but a probability. It would take the better part of 100 years to go from the largely independent development of firearms arcane runeplate, arcane accumulator, and the cerebral matrix to their integration into the ultimate weapon of the day, the colossal, and the means to control them in battle. Despite more than 4 additional centuries of development of these technologies, they are still recognizable to the eyes of modern arcanists and mechanics. Probably the most immediate effect of the colossal technology was the aptly named Colossal Wars of 250 to 257 AR, when King Levash Tepeshi of Kador went to war against the southern alliance of the other 3 kingdoms. The causes of this war have long been speculated at by historians, for plausible explanations are not in short supply, but the result of this period of conflict was destruction amongst the kingdoms such that the victors demanded that the Kadorans destroy what remained of their colossals and colossal constructing capacity. In turn, the Signarans and their allies eventually decommissioned their own force of colossals, having placed their resources in the technological development of the smaller, more versatile and, for the time, superior warjacks, using the design concepts of laborjacks and adapting them for war and battle. However, the core that made this technology possible in the first place, the cerebral matrix, was refined, improved, and made more efficient, becoming the cortex that, in one form or another, resides in every modern warjack. Little did King Dmitri of Kador and King Waldred of Signar know at the time, though, that colossals would one day make a return to Immoren's battlefields when the monarchs of these 2 great neighbours would not be anywhere so amicable. Signar was the first among the Iron Kingdoms to put a new model of Colossal into production, as the then Commander Adept Sebastian Nemo happened upon Orgoth ruins, a result of ancient battle during which a Colossal was brought down and its wreckage lost to time and nature. Combining new with old, Nemo added the Stormwall to Signar's armory barely 2 years later, and the Conquest was making its first parade appearance for the Empress's Review in Kursk. That same year, the Judicator arrived to terrorize Signaran soldiers crafted by kidnapped Caspian mechanics, compelled to by the fear of the lawgiver. Some of the other powers of Immoren were in reality already ahead of the Iron Kingdoms in this regard, but they held on to their secrets a great deal better. On the other side of this coin, where hope breeds development, fear breeds stagnation, as it were. Surprisingly, despite having the technology to do so, if perhaps in a suboptimal way, there has been very little inclination to find out what lays beyond the Meridius. Of course, the Western Immorees know who lays beyond the Meridius, or at least believe they do. The Orgoth came from the west and sent their tithes of slaves west, from where none returned. Despite achieving victory over them, it did come at great cost, and personal accounts that survive have been taken to heart. While there is reason to believe that Orgoth hold on whatever corner of Cain they call home is much weaker than it used to be, none in the Iron Kingdoms, but for the foolhardiest of exceptions, have any desire to confirm this. As a result, though the powers of Immoren squabble amongst themselves, those that care nonetheless count their blessings that the Orgoth have not made their horrifying presence known once more. All that is known about the lands from which the Orgoth sailed come from a scant collection of ill-kept journals that tell us of a temperate place with fertile lands, mountain ranges, and a jagged coastline dotted with myriad islands and islets. To an explorer, this is excellent fuel for the imagination, but for a statesman, this is nothing but words, and given the general reluctance to even explore the unseen coasts of Immoren, such as the Alkir subcontinent and the Shattered Spined Islands, it is little wonder that there is no desire to send expeditions across the Meridius. It is more than enough to many that contact, if ambivalent contact, has been made with the still mysterious Zoo from the south. Besides, enemies much closer to home preclude any ability to venture westward. The primary enemy of note for many Immorees is Crix. If there is any nation that profited from the expulsion of the Orgoth, it is the Nightmare Empire. When Drer Dracaring was destroyed and the Iron Liches poked through the remains, they found a great trove of necromantic lore that they instantly set about understanding, mastering, and putting to good use. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, were the Black Ships, occult ritual-infused naval architecture mimicking the Orgoth invasion's longships would make Crixian fleets the terror of the coasts for centuries, and they continue to do so now. Of a more immediate and individual scale, among the lore the Liches uncovered was that which detailed the Soul Cage, how they worked, what they did, and how to craft them. The Lich Lords of Crix are not known for taking half measures when it comes to manipulating souls to their ends, while many of their servants do the same with the corpses of the dead, recently or otherwise. We have the Orgoth to thank for this power, and even a little to thank for the mentality and how it is wielded. Perhaps less impactful, but no less important to the Crixian military industry, was the fate of the War Witches. Many covens were not destroyed when the invaders were finally eradicated in Western Immoren, and since they were all on Gulgast, they were captured and brought before the Dragonfather's lieutenants, who gave them a simple choice: serve or die. Given the Crixian predilection to conducting wars similar to their erstwhile masters, the War Witches chose service. They passed their profane rituals and indoctrination down to a new generation of witches, and by the time the last of them had died, Crix had at their command a new tradition of War Witch sirens, having adapted the War Witch methods to better suit Crixian sensibilities, such as they are. On the other hand, Cador's Grey Lord's Covenant managed their Orgoth findings differently. A splinter group from the Fraternal Order of Wizardry, the Covenant was founded on patriotic principles rather than those of intellectual elitism, and were deeply suspicious and resentful of their southern counterparts, believing them responsible for selling out the Cardic colossal construction to the Orgoth, who reacted as one might predict. Thus they answered the call of their king when the Colossal Wars commenced, crystallizing an ancient grudge and the basis of any and all underlying tensions between Cador and Signar throughout the Iron Kingdom's era and extending well into the modern era. However, while the Grey Lords understand what Orgoth artifacts are capable of, unlike their Crixian counterparts, they do not truly comprehend how or why these artifacts are as they are, whether their power, the source of said power, or the manner of operation. This is shown by their inability to replicate the weapons of Orgoth manufacture that they possess. Though Greylord abovniks have shown an aptitude for adapting Orgoth relics and weapons to traditional Khadoran mechanical technology, as the Warjack ruin shows, it is nonetheless imperfect, and they lack the necessary understanding of the soul cage and necromantic rituals central to Orgoth arcane power that the Crixians so gleefully took to with abandon. In this way, they are missing the most important keys to unlocking the full power of their Orgoth legacy weapons. It is a curious exercise to wonder what the Grey Lords and Doomreavers would be capable of if they had mastery over the souls of the dead and dying. It is well for many that they do not, and that the Lich Lords are not given to sharing their knowledge. Even so, this is not for lack of trying on the Grey Lords' part, as all within their order have an almost innate thirst for the knowledge that the Orgoth left behind. Any power is good if it serves the Covenant and the Empire. If news is heard of unearthing an Orgoth ruin, be in no doubt that either a Grey Lord was responsible for it, or a Grey Lord will intend to be responsible for it when the books are written. The artifacts found within are of immeasurable power and value to them, and they go to great length to secure them, sometimes no matter the cost. These ruins are worthy of note, as while some are harmless tombs or former fortifications, long since plundered and reclaimed by nature, many still bear the signs of their former Orgoth guardians and builders. Intrepid but foolish treasure hunters have been known to blunder into the wrong ruin and encounter the products of the foulest Orgoth occult rituals. Amongst others, excruciators, expert torturers and interrogators, dreads, the vile results of the excruciators' work, and the deathless, lords and commanders, driven mad by their ambitions, lurk within these tombs, bound to these places by ancient and yet strong necromantic rites. Quite how many ruins there are none can say, except that there are many, and that the perils which lay within them remain as terrible now as they were when they were first built. These ruins are dotted throughout all of the Iron Kingdoms, missing only from Rule and Ios in the main, for into those lands the Orgoth chose not to venture. Signs of the Orgoth occupation are blessedly few in these two nations, but while its influence is minimal in the land of the dwarves, the elves are perhaps the most unfortunate victims. Desperation drove the self-made gods of mankind to seek power for their worshippers in a deal that was perhaps unwise, though few would realize why until it was too late. Too late, certainly, for the Divine Court, for without the Orgoth invasion, there would be no deal with the Infernals that brought humanity the gift of magic, and so the Divine Court would likely have returned to the Veld before the modern era, and the priesthoods of the Fanes would not have suffered the rivening. And the Arcanists of mankind would not have to be part of the lottery that may result in their end thanks to radical and zealous Iosan assassins, as well as other enemies they would have had regardless, whether Grey Lord, Illuminated, Fraternal, Sulmenite, Ledger or other. As to the fate of the Orgoth themselves, theories abound as to their current state, even if people prefer to keep such thoughts to themselves. The same applies to the nature of their power and the source of their magic, though with the coming of the Infernals, many suspicions have been confirmed. Like the humans of Immoren, those of that far-off continent to the west came by their magical gifts by way of dealings with the Infernals. While we can only surmise as to what price they paid to be so empowered, no doubt it was high, with the Immoren slaves that they shipped west to serve as sacrifices in the Orgoth's place. Perhaps this is why they chose not to attempt the subjugation of the dwarves and the elves, that their souls were deemed worthless by the Orgoth for repayment to the Infernals. Nor do we know when the Orgoth were obliged to submit their repayment in full. Such gaps in our knowledge can only be filled by supposition and speculation that coincides with their absence from Immoren ever since they were driven from its shores. Similarly, from what few details that remain, it is possible that the Orgoth hold on western Immoren started to weaken as early as 190 BR, but this may only be the time when rulers in their homeland chose to give commanders overseas more independence in establishing Immoren as a permanent Orgoth fiefdom. Thus, the punitive measures taken against the religious sects, those groups considered most susceptible to insurgent behavior, could be seen as a desperate measure, or simply one of confirmation that the Immorees should be slaves for all time and be made to understand that position. No matter the reality of the Orgoth's change in approach, this was the trigger by which, step by step, humanity would fight back with realistic chances. They would do so until victory was a distinct possibility within 3 centuries, and fully realized in 4. The lack of reinforcements from the Orgoth homeland, especially during the final years of the rebellion, is notable, particularly since the arrival of the Colossals to the battlefield would have prompted some reaction as a then new and terrifying weapon to both sides, but instead the occupying forces were gradually and systematically defeated. No doubt the aftermath of the Riplung Plague had its effects as well, having made its way from Immoren across the Meridius. Some powers believe it devastated the Orgoth population to the extent that it is still not recovered, hundreds of years on. And with the dearth of activity from across the ocean over these past 4 centuries, this is most likely true, or at least those of the Iron Kingdoms hope it is.